The conference room fell silent as Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Properties Group, stood up and gestured toward me with a smile that could have powered the entire Heathman Hotel. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Alexandra Chen, our newest board member and the visionary behind our upcoming $50 million eco-resort project." Every head in that room turned toward me, including my father's. His face went white as the Portland morning fog, and for the first time in my 28 years, Robert Chen was completely speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alexandra Chen, and I need you to stay with me, because what happened in that boardroom was 2 years in the making. 2 years of proving wrong every person who said I'd amount to nothing. 2 years of building something extraordinary while my own family watched from the sidelines, shaking their heads and placing bets on my failure. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Portland. Rain tapping against my Pearl District apartment windows, the smell of Stumptown Coffee drifting up from the street below, and my phone buzzing with another text from my mother. "Your father's having people over for dinner Sunday. Try to dress appropriately this time. Appropriately. As if my business casual wasn't professional enough for a family gathering where my younger brother Marcus would inevitably show up in wrinkled khakis and a story about why his latest venture didn't work out. I was reviewing sustainability reports for a potential client when my phone rang. Victoria Sterling's name flashed across the screen, and my heart did that thing where it forgets how to beat properly. 3 months of proposals, presentations, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Sterling Properties Group wasn't just any client. They were the biggest name in luxury sustainable development on the West Coast, and they'd been my white whale since graduating with my MBA from University of Oregon 2 years earlier. "Alexandra," Victoria's voice was warm but direct, the way successful women learn to speak when they've spent decades proving themselves in boardrooms full of men. "I have news that I think you'll want to hear in person. Can you meet me at the Heathman in an hour?" An hour. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, smoothing down my blazer and wondering if this was the call that would change everything, or the polite rejection that would send me back to the drawing board. My consulting firm, Pinnacle Development Solutions, was barely 18 months old and surviving on smaller projects and my savings account. Landing Sterling Properties would mean everything. Not landing them would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, my father had been right all along. Robert Chen had built Chen & Walsh Construction from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in the 80s. By the time I was born, he was already the king of commercial construction in Portland, known for delivering projects on time and under budget using methods that hadn't changed much since he'd started. Traditional, reliable, profitable, everything. I apparently wasn't. I could still hear his voice from our last family dinner, the one where I'd made the mistake of mentioning my sustainable building certification and how the industry was shifting toward green construction. "Alexandra thinks she knows better than 20 years of experience," he'd said to David Walsh, his business partner, while I sat right there at the table. "She's got these fancy ideas about solar panels and recycled materials, but she doesn't understand that construction is about concrete and steel and getting the job done." Marcus had laughed, actually laughed, and added, "Dad, you know Alex. She's always had her head in the clouds. Remember when she wanted to be an astronaut?" The table had erupted in the kind of laughter that feels like tiny cuts, the kind that says your dreams are adorable until you're old enough to know better. But the moment that really broke something inside me happened 3 weeks later at the family business. I'd stopped by Chen & Walsh Construction to drop off some documents my mother had asked me to deliver, and I'd overheard my father on a phone call in his office. The door was cracked open, and his voice carried clearly into the hallway where I stood frozen. "David, I'm telling you, I'm worried about her," my father was saying. "She's almost 30 and still playing pretend with this consulting business. Alexandra's smart, but she doesn't have what it takes for the real world. She's Too soft, too idealistic. Marcus might not have the degree, but at least he understands how business actually works. There was a pause, and then David Walsh's voice, muffled but audible through the speakerphone. Maybe she just needs more time to figure it out. Some kids are late bloomers. No, my father's voice was firm, final. I've watched her for 2 years now. She's not cut out for this industry. She doesn't have the instincts, the toughness. Honestly, I think she'd be happier working for someone else, following someone else's vision instead of trying to create her own. Some people are leaders, and some people are followers. Alexandra's a follower. I'd stood in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, feeling something inside me crystallize into a cold, hard determination. My own father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with math homework, had just written my professional obituary over the phone, not because I'd failed, but because he couldn't see past his own assumptions about who I was supposed to be. That night, I'd gone home to my small apartment and done something I'd never done before. I'd written down every single doubt he'd ever expressed about my abilities, every dismissive comment, every time he'd changed the subject when I talked about my work. The list filled 2 pages, and by the time I was done, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Growing up in the Chen household had always been about proving yourself worthy of attention. My parents had immigrated with nothing but determination, and the belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. They'd built a successful life, a beautiful home in Laurelhurst, and a business that employed dozens of people. But somewhere along the way, they'd decided that success only looked one way, and it looked like my father. Marcus, 4 years younger, and blessed with my father's easy charm and willingness to follow established paths, had always been the obvious heir to Chen and Walsh Construction. Even when he'd dropped out of Portland State University halfway through his business degree, even when his attempts to contribute to the family business resulted in cost overruns and frustrated subcontractors, he was still learning the ropes and finding his way. Meanwhile, I'd graduated summa cum laude, earned my MBA, spent 2 years working for a major development firm learning every aspect of the industry, and then launched my own consultancy specializing in sustainable building practices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But because my approach was different, because I focused on environmental impact and long-term efficiency rather than just immediate profit margins, I was the one who was playing pretend and too idealistic for the real world. The double standard was suffocating, but it was also clarifying. I'd spent so many years trying to earn my father's approval, waiting for him to see that my success was just as valid as Marcus's potential. But that phone conversation had made it clear that no amount of achievement would change his fundamental belief about who I was and what I was capable of. So I'd stopped trying to prove myself to him and started proving myself to the people who mattered, to clients who valued innovation over tradition, to industry leaders who understood that sustainable building wasn't just a trend, but the future of construction. To mentors like James Rodriguez, the former CEO of Pacific Northwest Development, who'd taken me under his wing and taught me that being different wasn't a weakness. It was a competitive advantage. James had been the one to suggest I pursue Sterling Properties Group as a client. Victoria Sterling is exactly the kind of visionary who'll appreciate what you bring to the table, he'd told me over coffee 6 months earlier. She's building the future of luxury hospitality, and she needs someone who understands that sustainability and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. The proposal process had been grueling. Months of research, site visits to Bend, where Sterling was planning their eco-resort, countless revisions to architectural plans that balanced environmental responsibility with the kind of luxury experience Sterling's guests expected. I'd poured everything I had into that proposal, not just my expertise, but my vision for what construction could be when you thought beyond the immediate bottom line. And now, sitting in the lobby of the Heathman Hotel, Waiting for Victoria Sterling, I was about to find out if all of that work had been enough. The hotel's historic elegance felt like a good omen. Built in 1927 and meticulously maintained, it was proof that buildings could be both beautiful and enduring when they were designed with care and attention to detail. Victoria appeared right on time, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her handshake as confident as her reputation suggested. She was the kind of woman I'd always admired from a distance, successful without apology, direct without being cruel, someone who'd earned every bit of respect she commanded. "Alexandra," she said, settling into the leather chair across from me. "I'm going to cut straight to the point because I think you'll appreciate directness. Your proposal for the Ben project wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. You've managed to design something that will exceed our sustainability goals while actually reducing our construction costs over time. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "Thank you, Victoria. I've put everything I have into this project because I believe in what Sterling Properties represents. Which brings me to why I wanted to meet in person," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "We don't just want to hire Pinnacle Development Solutions for this project. We want you to join our board of directors. We're expanding our sustainable development division, and we need someone with your vision to help guide that expansion." The words hit me like a physical force. Board of Directors. Sterling Properties Group. The company that had transformed luxury hospitality across the Pacific Northwest wanted me to help shape their future. Me, the woman my own father thought was too soft for the real world. "I'm honored," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I have to ask, what made you choose me specifically?" Victoria smiled, and there was something knowing in her expression. "Alexandra, in 30 years of business, I've learned to recognize two types of people. Those who do things the way they've always been done because it's safe, and those who do things differently because it's necessary. You're the second type, and that's exactly what the industry needs right now." We talked for another hour about timelines, expectations, and the vision Sterling had for sustainable luxury development. By the time I walked out of the Heathman, I had a signed contract, a seat on the board of one of the most influential development companies on the West Coast, and the kind of professional validation I'd been working toward my entire career. But as I stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel, watching the Portland afternoon rain create rivers in the gutters, I felt something unexpected. Not just triumph, but a deep, quiet sadness. Because the person I most wanted to share this news with was the same person who'd never believed it was possible. The father who'd raised me to work hard and dream big, but somehow couldn't see that I'd been doing exactly that all along. I thought about calling him right then, about sharing this moment the way daughters are supposed to share good news with their fathers. But I remembered that phone conversation, the casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for, and I realized that some relationships require more than success to heal. They require recognition, respect, and the willingness to see someone as they actually are rather than as you've decided they should be. So instead of calling my father, I called James Rodriguez, the mentor who'd believed in me when my own family couldn't. His congratulations were genuine, his excitement infectious, and his advice was perfect. "Alexandra," he said, "this is just the beginning. You've proven that your vision works, that sustainable development isn't just good for the environment, it's good for business. Now you get to show the whole industry what you've been trying to tell them all along." That evening, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Portland skyline, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. Every rejection, every dismissive comment, every time someone had told me I was too young, too idealistic, too different, all of it had led here. To a moment when the biggest player in my industry had looked at my work and seen not just competence, but vision. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Don't forget about Sunday dinner. Your father's excited to tell everyone about Marcus's new project manager position at the company." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about how different this conversation would be if she knew what had happened today. If they knew that while they were celebrating Marcus's latest attempt to find his place in the family business, I'd just been invited to help shape the future of an entire industry. But they didn't know. And I realized I wasn't ready to tell them yet. This moment belonged to me, to the years of work and doubt and determination that had brought me here. There would be time later to share the news, to watch my father's face, as he processed the fact that his too-soft daughter had just achieved something he'd never imagined possible. For now, it was enough to know that I'd proven something to myself, that the voice inside me that said I could build something meaningful, something different, something better, that voice had been right all along. And tomorrow, I would start the work of turning that vision into reality, one sustainable building at a time. The rain kept falling outside my window, the kind of gentle, persistent Portland rain that nurtures everything it touches. I thought about roots growing deeper, about foundations being laid, about structures being built to last. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Sunday dinner at the Chen household had always been a performance, and tonight was no exception. The dining room table gleamed under the chandelier my mother had insisted on when they renovated the Laurelhurst house 5 years ago, and the smell of her famous braised pork filled the air with the kind of warmth that should have felt like home, but instead felt like stepping onto a stage where I'd never quite learned my lines. I arrived exactly on time, as always, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week, but seemed appropriate now that Sterling Properties was paying me the kind of salary that made my previous consulting fees look like pocket change. My mother answered the door with her usual once-over, taking in my outfit with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of social presentation. "Alexandra, you look professional," she said, which in Linda Chen's vocabulary was the equivalent of a compliment. "Come in. Everyone's here already." Everyone, of course, meant Marcus and his girlfriend Sarah, plus David Walsh and his wife Karen. The core group that had witnessed every major Chen family announcement for the past decade, from Marcus's high school graduation to his various career pivots to his recent promotion to project manager at Chen & Walsh Construction. Tonight, according to my mother's text, was supposed to be another celebration of Marcus's professional development. I found them in the living room, gathered around my father's leather armchair like planets orbiting the sun. Marcus was in the middle of what sounded like a familiar story about a difficult subcontractor, gesturing with his beer bottle in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of our father. Sarah nodded along with the enthusiasm of someone who'd learned that supporting Marcus's narratives was easier than questioning them. "Alexandra." David Walsh stood up to give me the kind of hug that business partners give their partners' children, hearty and brief. "How's the consulting business? Still trying to save the world one solar panel at a time?" The question hit exactly the way it was supposed to, with just enough humor to disguise the condescension. David had been asking variations of this same question for 2 years, ever since I'd started Pinnacle Development Solutions. Each time, I'd responded with polite updates about my work, watching his eyes glaze over as I talked about LEED certification and sustainable materials. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, I had information that would change the entire dynamic of this conversation, but I wasn't ready to share it yet. "Something like that," I said, settling into the spot my mother indicated on the sofa. "How are things at Chen & Walsh?" "Booming," my father said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd built something lasting. "We just landed the Morrison Street office complex, 24 stories. Marcus here is going to be overseeing the electrical systems integration." Marcus straightened up at the mention of his name, and I watched him transform into the version of himself he became around our father. Confident, authoritative, every inch the heir apparent to Chen & Walsh Construction. "It's a complex project," he said, launching into technical details that I happened to know he'd learned from Tom Peterson, the actual electrical contractor, who'd been handling systems integration for Chen and Walsh since before Marcus was old enough to hold a screwdriver. I listened to him talk about voltage requirements and electrical load calculations, marveling at how easily he wore expertise that wasn't quite his own. It was a skill I'd never mastered, that ability to sound authoritative about things I was still learning. Maybe that was part of what made me seem too soft to my father. I asked questions instead of making pronouncements. I admitted when I didn't know something instead of improvising confidence. "Alexandra, you should see the scope of this project," Karen Walsh said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. 24 stories, all glass and steel. Very impressive. "It sounds like a significant undertaking," I agreed, though privately I was thinking about the environmental impact assessment that a project like that would require, the energy efficiency challenges of an all-glass facade, the opportunities for innovative, sustainable systems that would probably never be considered because they weren't part of Chen and Walsh's traditional approach. "Traditional construction methods," my father said, as if he'd read my thoughts. "Proven materials, reliable techniques, that's how you deliver a project on time and on budget." There it was again, that subtle dig at everything I represented. Traditional versus innovative, proven versus experimental, reliable versus risky. The same conversation we'd been having in different forms for years, where my father positioned himself as the voice of experience and me as the naive idealist, who didn't understand how the real world worked. Dinner conversation followed its usual pattern. Updates on neighborhood gossip from my mother, business war stories from my father and David, relationship milestones from Marcus and Sarah. I contributed when directly asked questions, laughed at the appropriate moments, and tried not to think about how different this conversation would be if they knew about Victoria Sterling, about the board position, about the $50 million project that would make the Morrison Street complex look like a modest renovation. It was during dessert that the conversation took the turn I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. My mother had just served her famous green tea ice cream when David Walsh cleared his throat in the way that meant he was about to say something he thought was important. "Robert, you mentioned that Sterling Properties has been sniffing around some of the local firms," he said, setting down his spoon. "Any word on whether they're looking to partner with established companies for their upcoming projects?" My father leaned back in his chair, settling into his expert mode. "Sterling's a different kind of operation than what we usually deal with. High-end, very particular about their specifications. Word is they're planning something big in Bend. Some kind of eco-resort, probably too specialized for our wheelhouse." "Eco-resort?" Marcus perked up. That sounds like the kind of project Alexandra would be interested in, with all her environmental stuff. The comment was meant to be inclusive, I think, but it landed with the casual dismissiveness that characterized most of my family's references to my work. Environmental stuff. As if sustainable building practices were a hobby, rather than a rapidly growing sector of the construction industry. "Sterling Properties doesn't work with small consultancies," my father said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who'd researched the topic thoroughly. "They partner with major firms, companies with proven track records on large-scale projects. It's not the kind of opportunity that comes to people who are just starting out." Just starting out. I was 28 years old with an MBA and 2 years of successful consulting projects, but in my father's assessment, I was still just starting out, still unproven, still not ready for the real world of serious construction projects. "What kind of timeline are they looking at?" David asked, and I realized this wasn't casual dinner conversation. Chen and Walsh was actually considering pursuing Sterling Properties as a potential client. "From what I hear, they're moving fast," my father said. "They've got investors lined up, environmental permits in process, aggressive construction schedule, the kind of project that could define a company's reputation if you pull it off, or destroy it if you don't." "Sounds like exactly the kind of challenge we've been looking for," Marcus said. And I watched my father's face light up with the pride that came from seeing his son think like a businessman. "It would be a stretch for us," my father admitted. "Sterling's known for working with firms that specialize in sustainable construction, and that's not exactly our strength. But if we could land something like that, it would put Chen and Walsh in a completely different category." The irony was overwhelming. Here was my father, discussing the exact project I'd just been hired to oversee, talking about sustainable construction as if it were some mysterious specialty that his company couldn't possibly master. Meanwhile, I was sitting 3 feet away from him, the person Sterling Properties had specifically chosen to guide their sustainable development division, and he had no idea. "Maybe you should hire Alexandra as a consultant," Sarah suggested, and I could tell she thought she was being helpful. "She knows all about the environmental requirements and LEED certification and that kind of thing." The silence that followed her suggestion was brief but telling. My father's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was annoyed. David Walsh looked uncomfortable, as if Sarah had suggested something inappropriate. Marcus actually laughed, a short sound that wasn't quite mean but wasn't exactly kind either. "Sterling Properties works with established firms," my father said, finally, his voice gentle but firm. "They're not looking for consultants who are still building their reputation. This is the kind of project that requires experience, credibility, relationships that take decades to develop." Each word was like a small cut, precise and purposeful. Not because my father was trying to hurt me, but because he genuinely believed what he was saying. In his worldview, I was still the daughter who needed guidance, still the young professional who hadn't proven herself, still someone who played at business rather than someone who actually conducted it. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm sure Sterling Properties knows exactly what kind of partners they're looking for." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself studying my family with new eyes. These people who had shaped my understanding of success, who had taught me to work hard and dream big, somehow couldn't see that I'd been doing exactly that. They were so invested in their idea of who I was supposed to be that they couldn't recognize who I'd actually become. After dinner, I helped my mother clear the table while the men retreated to the living room to discuss business. It was a ritual as old as my childhood, this division of labor that nobody questioned anymore. I stacked plates and listened to my mother's commentary on the evening's conversation. "Your father's really excited about the possibility of working with Sterling Properties," she said, running water into the sink. "It would be such a wonderful opportunity for Marcus to work on a high-profile project." For Marcus, not for the company, not for the family business, but specifically for Marcus. Because in my mother's mind, as in my father's, Marcus was the future of Chen and Walsh Construction, and every opportunity was ultimately about preparing him for that role. "It sounds like a challenging project," I said, handing her the serving. "Bowls. That's what makes it perfect for him," she continued. "Marcus has been working so hard to learn the business, and your father thinks he's ready for more responsibility." David Walsh agrees. They both think Marcus has the instincts for leadership. The instincts for leadership. I thought about the board meeting I'd attended just 3 days earlier, where I'd presented Sterling Properties' quarterly sustainability goals to a room full of executives who hung on every word. I thought about the project timeline I'd developed, the vendor relationships I'd established, the innovative construction techniques I'd researched and proposed. But none of that counted as leadership in my family's assessment because it wasn't happening at Chen and Walsh Construction. "That's wonderful," I said, because what else could I say? That I was already leading the exact project they were hoping to bid on? That while they were discussing Marcus's readiness for responsibility, I was carrying responsibility they couldn't imagine. The evening wound down with the usual round of goodbyes and promises to get together soon. I hugged everyone appropriately, accepted my mother's leftovers graciously, and drove home through the Portland evening feeling like I'd spent 3 hours in an alternate universe where everything I'd accomplished had somehow been erased. Back in my Pearl District apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange duality of my life. At Sterling Properties, I was Alexandra Chen, board member and visionary leader. At family dinners, I was still the daughter who was too soft for the real world, still trying to prove herself, still not quite ready for serious responsibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Sterling. "Hope you're settling into your new role well. Looking forward to introducing you to the full team next week. Your insights are already making a difference." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about the disconnect between how my industry colleagues saw me and how my own family perceived me. Victoria Sterling, one of the most successful developers on the West Coast, valued my insights. James Rodriguez, former CEO of Pacific Northwest Development, sought my advice on sustainable building trends. But my own father still talked about me like I was a recent college graduate playing at entrepreneurship. The realization that had been building all evening finally crystallized into something clear and actionable. I wasn't going to tell my family about Sterling Properties yet. Not because I was ashamed or uncertain, but because I was tired of trying to prove myself to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be. Instead, I was going to let my work speak for itself. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to Victoria Sterling's assistant, requesting a meeting to discuss the Bend project timeline. If Chen and Walsh Construction was interested in pursuing Sterling Properties as a client, they would have to go through the formal bidding process like everyone else. And that bidding process would be overseen by the company's newest board member, a specialist in sustainable construction who understood exactly what Sterling Properties was looking for in a partner. The irony was perfect. My father's company would have to prove themselves to me, the daughter he didn't think was ready for the real world. They would have to demonstrate their capabilities to the woman they saw as too idealistic, too soft, too inexperienced for serious construction projects. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. The kind of justice that comes not from tearing others down, but from building yourself up so high that the people who dismissed you have no choice but to look up and finally see who you really are. The rain had stopped, and Portland sparkled in the darkness like a circuit board, all interconnected lights and flowing energy. I thought about foundations and frameworks, about structures that looked simple from the outside but required complex engineering to remain standing. I thought about my own foundation, built not on my family's approval, but on my own competence, my own vision, my own refusal to accept limitations that others tried to place on me. Tomorrow, I would start the process of evaluating potential construction partners for Sterling Properties' Bend project. I would review proposals, assess capabilities, and make recommendations based purely on merit and qualifications. And when Chen and Walsh Construction submitted their bid, I would evaluate it with the same professional objectivity I applied to every other applicant. But tonight, I allowed myself to imagine the moment when my father would realize that the daughter he'd dismissed as too soft for the real world was actually the person holding the keys to his company's biggest opportunity. The moment when he would understand that while he'd been explaining to dinner guests why I wasn't ready for serious responsibility, I'd been quietly taking on more responsibility than he'd ever imagined possible. I finished my wine and closed my laptop, feeling the kind of calm that comes from finally understanding your own power. Not the power to hurt or diminish others, but the power to succeed so completely that other people's limitations on your potential become irrelevant. The city lights blurred slightly as I blinked away tears that weren't sad, but something else entirely. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. The tears that come when you finally stop trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for you and start building spaces of your own. The Sterling Properties conference room on the 23rd floor of the U.S. Bancorp Tower offered a view of Portland that made the city look like a carefully designed model, all clean lines and purposeful placement. I sat at the mahogany table reviewing construction bids for the Bend Eco Resort project. my Mont Blanc pen moving steadily across evaluation sheets as I assessed each proposal with the methodical precision that had made me valuable to Victoria Sterling in the first place. 18 companies had submitted bids for the $50 million project. Major firms from Seattle, established contractors from California, and a handful of local companies that had somehow managed to meet Sterling Properties' stringent pre-qualification requirements. Each proposal represented months of work, detailed cost analyses, project timelines, and sustainability commitments that would determine whether these companies had a future with one of the West Coast's most influential developers. I paused when I reached the familiar letterhead. Chen and Walsh Construction. My father's company logo, designed 15 years ago when he'd decided the business needed a more professional image, stared back at me from the top of a 40-page proposal that someone had clearly spent considerable time preparing. The executive summary was written in Marcus's style, enthusiastic and confident, with just enough technical detail to sound authoritative without getting bogged down in specifics. Project overview. Chen and Walsh Construction brings 23 years of commercial development experience to Sterling Properties' vision for sustainable luxury hospitality. Our proven track record of on-time, on-budget delivery, combined with our commitment to innovative construction methodologies, positions us as the ideal partner for this transformative project. Innovative construction methodologies. I almost smiled at the phrase. 3 weeks ago, my father had dismissed sustainable building practices as too specialized for his company's wheelhouse. Now, apparently, Chen and Walsh was committed to innovation. It was remarkable how quickly a company's core values could evolve when a $50 million contract was at stake. I flipped through the technical specifications, noting the careful language that promised compliance with all environmental requirements, without actually demonstrating any previous experience with LEED certification or sustainable construction techniques. The cost estimates were competitive, the timeline was aggressive but achievable, and the references were solid. It was exactly the kind of bid my father's company always submitted: professional, reliable, and utterly conventional. My phone buzzed with a text from James Rodriguez. "How's the bid evaluation process going? Any surprises in the applicant pool?" James had been instrumental in establishing Sterling Properties' vendor selection criteria, and he took a personal interest in seeing those standards upheld. I typed back quickly. "Reviewing 18 proposals, some interesting approaches to the sustainability requirements, a few companies that are clearly stretching beyond their usual expertise." His response came immediately. "That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from companies willing to push their own boundaries, as long as they have the right project leadership." Project leadership. That was the key question with every bid, wasn't it? Not just whether a company could pour concrete or install electrical systems, but whether they had leaders who understood the vision behind the project, who could navigate the complex requirements of sustainable construction while maintaining the luxury standards Sterling Properties was known for. I returned to the Chen and Walsh proposal, reading more carefully this time. The project management structure placed Marcus as the primary liaison between the construction team and Sterling Properties, with my father providing oversight and David Walsh handling contract administration. It was a logical arrangement for a company transitioning leadership to the next generation, assuming that next generation was actually ready for the responsibility. The sustainability section was the weakest part of their proposal, a collection of generic commitments and borrowed language that revealed exactly how much Chen and Walsh actually understood about green building practices. They promised to incorporate environmentally responsible materials where feasible and explore opportunities for energy-efficient systems integration. It was the kind of vague language companies used when they didn't want to commit to specifics they might not be able to deliver. I made notes in the margins, the same professional comments I would make on any inadequate proposal. Sustainability commitments lack specificity. No demonstrated experience with LEED certification processes. Timeline assumes conventional construction methods without accounting for green building complexities. It wasn't personal. It was professional evaluation based on the same criteria I applied to every other bidder. But as I wrote those comments, I couldn't help thinking about the Sunday dinner conversation, about my father's certainty that Sterling Properties would never work with small consultancies, about his assumption that serious projects required the kind of established credibility that only came with decades of experience. My office door opened, and Victoria Sterling walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of focused expression that meant she was ready to make decisions. At 62, Victoria had the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years in an industry that didn't welcome women and had not only survived, but thrived by being better prepared, more decisive, and more visionary than any of her competitors. "How's the evaluation coming?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Any clear frontrunners emerging?" I gestured to the stack of proposals. 3 companies that meet all our requirements, 5 that are close but have some gaps, and the rest that submitted bids but clearly don't understand what we're looking for. Victoria nodded, sipping her coffee. "What about local firms? I know we've prioritized companies with sustainable construction experience, but I'm always interested in supporting regional businesses when they can deliver what we need." "A few local companies in the mix," I said, carefully. "One in particular that has solid conventional construction experience but limited sustainability expertise. They'd need significant support to meet our green building requirements." "Tell me about them." I picked up the Chen & Walsh proposal, choosing my words with the same care I'd use to discuss any potential vendor. Chen & Walsh Construction. 23 years in business, good reputation for commercial projects, financially stable. The concern is that they're bidding outside their core competency. Their sustainability plan reads like it was written by someone who researched the topic online, rather than someone with actual experience implementing green building practices. Victoria leaned forward, interested. "What's your assessment of their capability to learn? Sometimes companies that are hungry enough to stretch beyond their comfort zone can surprise you." It was a fair question, and one that required me to separate my professional judgment from my personal knowledge of the company. Could Chen & Walsh actually deliver on a sustainable construction project if given the chance? Did they have the leadership, the adaptability, the commitment to quality that such a project would require? Their project management structure puts a lot of responsibility on someone who doesn't appear to have experience managing projects of this scale or complexity, I said. Marcus Chen is listed as the primary liaison, but his background suggests he's been working more as a junior project manager than as someone ready to oversee a $50 million development. What about senior oversight? Robert Chen, the founder, has the experience but not necessarily the vision for sustainable construction. He built his reputation on traditional methods, and the proposal suggests he's viewing this project as a conventional build with some environmental add-ons rather than an integrated sustainable development. Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying my notes. "It sounds like you don't think they're the right fit for this project." "I think they're a competent construction company that's bidding on work they're not qualified to handle," I said. Which isn't unusual. A lot of firms are trying to break into sustainable construction because they see where the market is heading. But wanting to do something and being able to do it well are 2 different things. She nodded slowly. "Your recommendation?" "Focus on the 3 firms that have proven track records with similar projects. Companies that understand sustainable construction isn't just about using recycled materials, but about integrating environmental considerations into every aspect of the build process." Victoria stood up, gathering her coffee cup. "I trust your judgment completely. You know this industry better than anyone I've worked with, and your insights have been invaluable since you joined the board. Draft a short list of your top 3 recommendations, and we'll move forward with final interviews next week." After she left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Portland skyline and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. I'd evaluated Chen & Walsh Construction with complete professional objectivity, applying the same standards I would to any other bidder. The fact that it was my father's company didn't change the fundamental question. Could they deliver the kind of project Sterling Properties needed? The answer, based purely on the evidence in their proposal, was no. Not because they lacked integrity or work ethic, but because they lacked the specialized knowledge and experience that sustainable construction required. They were a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, and pretending otherwise would serve no one's interests. I thought about Marcus, who would probably never understand why his company's bid had been rejected. In his worldview, construction was construction, and any experienced contractor should be able to handle any project. The idea that sustainable development required fundamentally different approaches, different materials, different expertise, wouldn't occur to him because he'd never been forced to think beyond the conventional methods Chen & Walsh had always used. My father would be disappointed, but not surprised. In his mind, Sterling Properties would naturally choose a larger, more established firm with better connections and deeper pockets. He wouldn't question his company's qualifications because he'd already convinced himself that qualification was less important than politics, that getting passed over was inevitable. For a regional firm competing against national companies, neither of them would consider the possibility that their bid had been evaluated by someone who knew their capabilities intimately, someone who understood exactly what they could and couldn't deliver, someone who had once been willing to overlook their limitations, but was no longer willing to compromise professional standards for family loyalty. My phone rang, displaying James Rodriguez's number. I answered on the second ring, grateful for the distraction. "Alexandra, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," he said without preamble. "About companies stretching beyond their usual expertise. I wanted to make sure you're not being too conservative in your evaluations." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes the most innovative partnerships come from working with companies that are hungry enough to exceed their own expectations. Obviously, you can't compromise on core qualifications, but there's value in identifying firms that have the foundation to build new capabilities." I leaned back in my chair, considering his point. "Are you suggesting I should give more weight to potential rather than proven experience?" "I'm suggesting you should trust your instincts about which companies have the leadership and adaptability to succeed, even if they haven't done exactly this type of project before. You have better judgment about construction capabilities than anyone I know." After we hung up, I found myself reconsidering the Chen & Walsh proposal. Not because James had suggested I be more flexible, but because his comment about leadership and adaptability had made me think more carefully about what those qualities actually looked like. Marcus had enthusiasm and willingness to learn, but did he have the judgment to make complex decisions under pressure? My father had decades of experience, but did he have the flexibility to adapt his methods when traditional approaches weren't sufficient? David Walsh was a capable administrator, but did he have the vision to guide a project that required constant innovation and problem-solving? I pulled up Chen & Walsh's financial records, their insurance documentation, their safety reports, their client references. On paper, they were exactly the kind of company Sterling Properties typically worked with: stable, reliable, financially sound. But this wasn't a typical project, and typical qualifications might not be sufficient. I called Sandra Martinez, the project manager who'd overseen Chen & Walsh's most recent commercial development, a 12-story office building downtown that had been completed 6 months ahead of schedule and under budget. "Sandra, this is Alexandra Chen from Sterling Properties. I'm calling about Chen & Walsh Construction. You worked with them on the Morrison Street project?" "Yes, absolutely. Solid company, good communication, no surprises. Robert Chen runs a tight operation, and his son Marcus was very involved in the day-to-day coordination. Why, are you considering them for a project?" "We're evaluating bids for a sustainable development project. How would you assess their flexibility when it comes to non-standard construction requirements? There was a pause. What kind of non-standard requirements? LEED certification, integrated renewable energy systems, sustainable materials sourcing, that kind of thing. Another pause, longer this time. To be honest, that's not really Chen and Walsh's wheelhouse. They're excellent at what they do, but what they do is pretty traditional commercial construction. If you're looking for sustainable building expertise, you might want to consider firms that specialize in that area. It was exactly the assessment I'd expected, and it confirmed what I'd already concluded. Chen and Walsh was bidding on work they weren't qualified to handle, not because they were dishonest, but because they didn't fully understand what the project required. I spent the rest of the afternoon finalizing my evaluation reports for all 18 bidders. 3 companies made my shortlist: Pacific Green Construction from Seattle, with extensive experience in sustainable hospitality projects; Renewable Development Partners from San Francisco, specialists in LEED Platinum certification; and Cascade Sustainable Builders from Eugene, a smaller firm with an innovative approach to integrated renewable energy systems. Chen and Walsh Construction received the same professional, thorough evaluation as every other bidder. Their strengths were clearly documented: financial stability, local presence, solid reputation for conventional projects. Their weaknesses were equally clear: no demonstrated experience with sustainable construction, limited understanding of green building requirements, project management structure that placed critical responsibility on someone without sufficient experience. My recommendation was straightforward and defensible. Chen and Walsh Construction did not meet the specialized qualifications required for this project, not because they were a bad company, but because they were the wrong company for Rio. This particular job, I printed my final reports and placed them in a folder for Victoria's review. Tomorrow, she would make the official decision about which companies to invite for final interviews. The 3 firms on my shortlist would have the opportunity to present their proposals in person, to demonstrate their understanding of sustainable construction principles, to prove they could deliver the kind of project Sterling Properties envisioned. Chen and Walsh Construction would receive a polite letter thanking them for their interest and encouraging them to consider future opportunities that better matched their qualifications. It was the same letter dozens of other companies would receive, a standard rejection that revealed nothing about who had made the decision or why. As I prepared to leave the office, I thought about the strange circularity of the situation. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in my family's dining room listening to my father explain why I wasn't ready for serious construction projects. Now I was sitting in Sterling Properties headquarters, having just determined that his company wasn't ready for the kind of project I'd been hired to oversee. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like clarity. The same clarity that had driven every decision I'd made since starting Pinnacle Development Solutions. The understanding that competence and connection weren't the same thing, that professional relationships required mutual respect and shared vision, that being family didn't automatically qualify someone for opportunities they hadn't earned. I gathered my things and headed for the elevator, thinking about the conversation I would not be having at Sunday dinner this week. I wouldn't mention the bid evaluation process, wouldn't explain why Chen and Walsh hadn't made the shortlist, wouldn't reveal that the daughter my father considered too soft for the real world had just made decisions that would affect his company's future. Instead, I would let the results speak for themselves. When Chen and Walsh received their rejection letter, when they learned that Sterling Properties had chosen to work with more specialized firms, my father would draw his own conclusions about why they hadn't been selected. Those conclusions would probably involve politics, connections, and the inherent advantages that larger companies had over regional firms. He would never suspect that his company had been evaluated by someone who knew their capabilities better than anyone, someone who had applied exactly the kind of rigorous professional standards he claimed to value, someone who had chosen competence over convenience and vision over familiarity. The elevator descended toward the parking garage, carrying me away from the decision that would reshape my family's understanding of my professional capabilities, even though they didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, Victoria Sterling would approve my recommendations. Next week, we would begin final interviews with companies that actually understood what sustainable construction required. And sometime after that, my father would have to confront the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the daughter he'd dismissed as too idealistic for the real world had been operating in a version of that world he'd never imagined. The rejection letter arrived at Chen & Walsh Construction on a Thursday morning, delivered with the same efficiency that Sterling Properties applied to all their business communications. I wasn't there to witness my father opening the envelope, but I learned about it from my mother's phone call that evening, her voice tight with the kind of controlled disappointment that the Chen family had perfected over decades of managing expectations. "Your father's quite upset," she said without preamble, the way she always delivered news that required immediate context. Sterling Properties passed on Chen & Walsh for that big project in Bend. After all the work Marcus put into that proposal, I was in my kitchen preparing dinner, salmon with sustainable sourced vegetables from the Portland Farmers Market, and I found myself gripping the phone a little tighter as I processed the information I'd been expecting for 3 days. "That's disappointing," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Did they give any reason for the decision?" "Something about specialized qualifications and sustainable construction experience. Your father thinks they were always planning to go with a larger firm and just went through the motions with local companies to look fair." My mother's tone carried the familiar note of resignation that accompanied most Chen family discussions of business setbacks. "Marcus is taking it especially hard. He really thought this could be his chance to prove himself on a major project." The weight of that statement settled on me like a physical pressure. Marcus taking it hard. My brother, who had never doubted his own capabilities, who had sailed through life assuming that opportunities would present themselves when he was ready for them, was experiencing the kind of professional rejection that had shaped my entire career trajectory. "I'm sure other opportunities will come along," I said, the platitude feeling hollow even as I spoke it. "Your father's not so optimistic. He says Sterling Properties sets the standard for luxury development in this region. And if they don't think Chen & Walsh is qualified for their projects, other high-end clients might start questioning our capabilities too." I hadn't considered that ripple effect, the way that being passed over by Sterling Properties might influence other potential clients' perceptions of Chen & Walsh. In my father's world, reputation was everything, and being deemed unqualified by an industry leader could have consequences that extended far beyond a single lost contract. "Has Dad considered that maybe Sterling Properties was looking for something very specific?" I asked carefully. Sustainable construction is becoming such a specialized field. He keeps saying that construction is construction, that good contractors should be able to handle any project. But Marcus thinks maybe they need to start learning more about the environmental requirements, getting certified in that LEED thing you're always talking about. Marcus thinks. The phrase hung in the air. Between us, loaded with implications. My brother, who had dismissed my expertise as environmental stuff just weeks earlier, was now recognizing that sustainable construction might actually be a legitimate specialization requiring specific knowledge and credentials. That might be a smart investment for the future, I said, choosing my words with diplomatic precision. The industry is definitely moving in that direction. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment's dining nook, looking out at the Portland evening and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. My mother's call had been intended as a simple family update, the kind of news sharing that kept the Chen household connected across the various disappointments and achievements that marked our individual lives. But for me, it was confirmation that my professional decision was cascading through my family's world in exactly the way I'd anticipated. Chen & Walsh Construction wasn't just dealing with a rejected bid. They were confronting the reality that their traditional approach to construction might not be sufficient for the kind of projects that represented the future of their industry. My father, who had built his reputation on proven methods and reliable execution, was facing the possibility that proven and reliable might not be enough anymore. The irony was exquisite. For years, my family had treated my focus on sustainable construction as a niche interest, a specialization that was nice to have, but not essential for serious business success. Now they were discovering that what they'd dismissed as environmental idealism was actually a professional requirement for competing at the highest levels of their industry. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hey, can we grab coffee sometime this week? Want to pick your brain about some stuff?" I stared at the message for a long moment, recognizing the shift it represented. Marcus had never asked to pick my brain about anything related to construction or business. Our conversations typically centered on family gossip, weekend plans, or his various theories about why certain projects had or hadn't gone well. But now, apparently, he wanted my insights about stuff that was almost certainly related to sustainable construction and LEED certification. I texted back, "Sure, how about Saturday morning? Stumptown on Division?" His response came immediately. "Perfect. Thanks. Really appreciate it." Really appreciate it. 4 words that marked a fundamental change in how my brother viewed my professional expertise. For the first time in our adult relationship, Marcus was approaching me as someone who possessed knowledge he needed, rather than someone who had interesting but ultimately irrelevant opinions about environmental issues. The rest of the week passed in a blur of Sterling Properties meetings and project development calls. The final interviews for the Bend Eco Resort contract went exactly as I'd expected. Pacific Green Construction demonstrated deep understanding of sustainable building systems. Renewable Development Partners presented innovative approaches to energy efficiency, and Cascade Sustainable Builders offered creative solutions for integrating renewable technology into luxury hospitality design. Victoria Sterling and I debriefed after each interview, and our assessments aligned perfectly. All 3 finalists understood that sustainable construction wasn't an add-on to traditional building methods, but a fundamentally different approach that required specialized expertise, innovative thinking, and long-term vision. They spoke our language, understood our priorities, and could deliver the kind of project that would set new standards for environmentally responsible luxury development. "I'm glad we held out for the right partners," Victoria said after our final evaluation meeting. "6 months ago, I might have been tempted to work with a traditional contractor and try to retrofit sustainable practices. But your guidance has helped me understand that this project requires partners who see sustainability as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." That guidance, my insights, my professional judgment, it was gratifying to have my expertise recognized and valued, especially in the context of a decision that would affect my family's business. I'd made the right call for Sterling Properties, and that call happened to demonstrate exactly why Chen & Walsh wasn't qualified for projects at this level. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Portland weather that made coffee shops feel like refugees from the world. I arrived at Stumptown 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table where Marcus and I could talk without being overheard. The cafe was busy with its usual weekend crowd of freelancers, students, and couples lingering over elaborate espresso drinks. But our corner offered enough privacy for what I suspected would be a significant conversation. Marcus appeared exactly on time, looking uncharacteristically serious as he navigated through the cafe's maze of mismatched furniture. He'd always been the more naturally confident of the Chen siblings, quick to smile and easy in social situations. But today he carried himself with the kind of focused intensity that suggested this conversation mattered to him in ways he wasn't used to experiencing. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I know you're busy with your consulting work." "Of course," I said, noting that he'd called it consulting work rather than environmental stuff or sustainable building. Small changes in language that reflected larger shifts in perception. "How are things at Chen & Walsh?" His expression tightened slightly. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about. I'm sure Mom told you about the Sterling Properties thing. She mentioned it. I'm sorry it didn't work out. Marcus nodded, stirring his coffee with the kind of deliberate attention that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. The thing is, I keep thinking about why we got passed over. The rejection letter was pretty generic, but Dad talked to some people in the industry, and it sounds like Sterling Properties is really serious about the sustainable construction angle. Like, more serious than we realized when we put together our bid. I waited, letting him work through his thoughts without rushing to fill the silence. So, I've been doing some research, he continued, reading about LEED certification and green building standards and all that. And honestly, Alex, I'm starting to realize how much I don't know about this stuff, how much our whole company doesn't know. The admission hung between us, honest and vulnerable in a way that was new for Marcus. He'd always been the brother who had answers, who approached challenges with confidence that solutions would emerge through effort and determination. But sustainable construction had revealed the limits of that approach, had shown him that some problems required specialized knowledge rather than general competence. It's a complex field, I said gently. Most traditional contractors are in the same position. The industry has been evolving faster than a lot of companies have been able to keep up with. But you've been keeping up with it, he said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. You've been working in this area for 2 years now? And you actually understand how it all fits together. I've been learning, I said, which was true even if it didn't capture the full extent of my current expertise. There's always more to discover. Marcus leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Do you think there's a way for Chen and Walsh to get up to speed on sustainable construction? Like really up to speed? Not just adding a paragraph to our proposals about using recycled materials? It was a fair question, and one that required me to separate my role as Marcus's sister from my professional assessment of Chen and Walsh's capabilities. Could a traditional construction company successfully transition to sustainable building practices? The answer was complicated, involving factors like leadership commitment, financial investment, staff training, and fundamental shifts in operational philosophy. It's possible, I said carefully, but it would require a significant commitment. Not just learning new techniques, but understanding the integrated systems approach that sustainable construction requires. Everything from material sourcing to energy systems to waste management has to be considered as part of a comprehensive environmental strategy. What would that look like practically, like if we really wanted to become competitive for projects? Like the Sterling Properties thing? I found myself in the strange position of consulting for my father's company, providing strategic advice that could help Chen and Walsh develop the capabilities they'd lacked when bidding on my own project. It was surreal, but it was also an opportunity to guide my family's business toward approaches I genuinely believed would benefit both their company and the broader construction industry. First, someone in leadership would need to get LEED certification, I said. Not just basic knowledge, but actual credentialed expertise. Then you'd need to develop relationships with suppliers who specialize in sustainable materials, subcontractors who understand green building systems, consultants who can handle environmental impact assessments. Marcus was taking notes on his phone, typing rapidly as I outlined the steps required for a traditional construction company to develop sustainable building capabilities. It was strange to watch my brother, who had never shown much interest in my professional opinions, documenting my insights with the kind of attention he usually reserved for conversations with our father. How long would something like that take? He asked. To get basic competency? Maybe a year of focused effort? To become truly competitive with companies that have been specializing in sustainable construction? Probably 3 to 5 years, assuming serious investment in training and equipment. And in the meantime, we'd probably keep losing out on the high-end projects that are moving toward sustainability requirements. Possibly, I said, though privately I thought it was more than possible. The construction industry was evolving rapidly, and companies that didn't adapt would find themselves increasingly marginalized from the most profitable and prestigious projects. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd told him. Then he looked up with the kind of direct eye contact that suggested he was about to ask something important. "Alex, would you be willing to help us? I mean, as a consultant or advisor, or whatever." Dad's pretty shaken up about the Sterling Properties thing, and I think he's finally ready to admit that maybe we need to learn from someone who actually knows this stuff. The question caught me off guard, even though I'd seen it coming from the moment Marcus had suggested coffee. My brother was asking me to help save the family business, to share my expertise with the company that had always treated my specialization as irrelevant, to work with the father who had dismissed my capabilities just weeks earlier. "What exactly are you thinking?" I asked, buying time to consider the implications of what he was proposing. "Maybe you could help us develop a sustainability strategy, train our project managers on green building requirements, help us understand what we need to do to be competitive for these kinds of projects. We'd pay your standard consulting rates. Obviously, this would be business, not family." Business, not family. The distinction was important because it meant Marcus understood that my expertise had value independent of our sibling relationship. It meant he was approaching me as a professional whose services could benefit Chen and Walsh Construction, not as a sister who should help out of family loyalty. "I'd need to think about it," I said honestly. "There might be some conflicts of interest to consider, given that I work with developers who could potentially be your clients." "Of course," Marcus said quickly. "I just wanted to know if you'd be open to the idea in principle." Dad's pride took a real hit with the Sterling Properties rejection, but I think it also opened his eyes to how much the industry has changed. He's ready to learn, even if it means admitting he doesn't know everything. Dad's ready to learn. Those words carried more weight than Marcus probably realized. Robert Chen, who had built his identity around being the expert, the authority, the one who understood how construction really worked, was apparently willing to acknowledge that his knowledge had gaps that needed to be filled. "Let me think about it," I said again. "And maybe you should talk to Dad about what kind of help he's actually looking for before we get too far into the details." Marcus nodded, pocketing his phone. "Fair enough. But Alex, I want you to know that I'm starting to understand what you've been trying to tell us about sustainable construction. It's not just environmental stuff. It's the future of the industry, isn't it?" "I think it's one possible future," I said diplomatically. "But yes, it's becoming increasingly important for companies that want to compete at the highest levels." We finished our coffee and parted with a hug that felt different from our usual family embraces. There was a new respect in how Marcus looked at me, a recognition that I possessed something valuable that he needed. For the first time in our adult relationship, he was seeing me as someone who could help solve his problems, rather than someone whose problems he occasionally helped solve. Walking back to my car through the drizzling Portland morning, I thought about the unexpected turn my family relationships were taking. The Sterling Properties decision had created consequences I'd anticipated, and some I hadn't. Yes, Chen and Walsh had been forced to confront their limitations in sustainable construction. But instead of dismissing those limitations or blaming external factors, they were apparently ready to address them seriously. The question now was whether I was ready to help them. Working with Chen and Walsh would mean regular interaction with my father, collaborative discussions about business strategy, professional relationships that would inevitably intersect with family dynamics. It would mean watching Robert Chen struggle to learn concepts that I'd mastered years earlier, seeing him ask for guidance from the daughter he'd considered too soft for the real world. But it would also mean the possibility of genuinely helping my family's business succeed, of sharing knowledge that could benefit not just Chen and Walsh, but the entire construction industry as more traditional companies transitioned to sustainable practices. It would mean being valued for my expertise rather than tolerated for my idealism. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Sterling. Heard through the grapevine that you might be considering some consulting work with local firms. As long as there are no conflicts with Sterling Properties projects, I think that's a wonderful way to share your expertise with the broader industry. I smiled at the message, recognizing Victoria's diplomatic way of letting me know that she'd somehow learned about my conversation with Marcus and approved of the possibility. In her world, knowledge was meant to be shared. Expertise was meant to elevate the entire industry, and the best professionals were those who helped others succeed rather than hoarding their advantages. The drive home gave me time to think about what consulting for Chen and Walsh would actually involve. Beyond the technical training and certification processes, there would be deeper challenges. Changing company culture, shifting operational priorities, convincing longtime employees that sustainable construction wasn't just a marketing gimmick, but a fundamental improvement in how buildings should be designed and built. It would be difficult work, requiring patience and diplomacy, and the ability to guide people through changes they might resist. But it would also be meaningful work, the kind that could genuinely improve both my family's business prospects and the environmental impact of every project they completed. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. I would help Chen and Walsh develop sustainable construction capabilities, not as a family favor, but as a professional engagement that could benefit everyone involved. My father's company would get the expertise they needed to compete for high-end projects. I would get the satisfaction of seeing my knowledge applied in ways that could make a real difference. And maybe, just maybe, my family would finally understand that the daughter they'd underestimated had been building something valuable all along. The boardroom at Sterling Properties had never felt more like a stage than it did on the morning of our quarterly stakeholder presentation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Portland, and the polished mahogany table reflected the faces of 12 industry leaders who had gathered to hear updates on our most significant projects. Among them sat my father, Robert Chen, representing the newly contracted sustainable construction team for Phase 2 of the Bend Eco Resort development. 6 months had passed since that coffee conversation with Marcus. 6 months of intensive collaboration that had transformed both Chen and Walsh construction and my relationship with my family. What had started as reluctant consulting had evolved into a comprehensive partnership that neither of us had anticipated. Chen and Walsh had earned their LEED certification, retrained their project managers, and successfully completed 2 smaller sustainable construction projects that served as stepping stones to this moment. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of the table, radiating the confidence that came from overseeing a project that was exceeding every expectation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that the Bend Eco Resort Phase 1 construction has been completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 12% under budget, while achieving LEED Platinum certification. This success has been possible because of our exceptional project management team. She gestured toward the presentation screen, where architectural renderings displayed the stunning integration of luxury hospitality and environmental responsibility that had become Sterling Properties' signature approach. Solar panels disguised as decorative roof elements, geothermal heating systems hidden beneath carefully designed landscaping, and locally sourced materials that created warmth without compromising sustainability standards. The success of Phase 1 has enabled us to accelerate our timeline for Phase 2, a $50 million expansion that will establish new industry standards for sustainable luxury development. I'm excited to introduce the leadership team that will guide this next phase. My heart began to beat faster as Victoria moved through her prepared remarks. This was the moment I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. The public revelation of professional relationships that would reshape how everyone in this room understood my role in the industry. Our Phase 2 project will be overseen by Alexandra Chen, Sterling Properties Director of Sustainable Development and the architect of our integrated environmental strategy. Victoria's eyes found mine across the room, offering the kind of supportive smile that reminded me why I'd chosen to work with her in the first place. Alexandra's vision has been instrumental in establishing Sterling Properties as the Pacific Northwest's leader in sustainable luxury construction. Director of Sustainable Development. The promotion had been announced internally 2 weeks earlier, along with a salary increase that reflected my expanded responsibilities and proven track record. But this was the first time my new title had been shared publicly. The first time my family was hearing that their daughter had become a director at one of the region's most influential development companies. I stood to acknowledge the introduction, scanning the faces around the table and noting my father's expression of carefully controlled surprise. He'd known I was working with Sterling Properties in some capacity, but the specifics of my role had never been discussed during our recent consulting sessions. In his mind, I was still Alexandra the consultant, the advisor who helped with sustainability questions, not Alexandra the executive who shaped corporate strategy. "Thank you, Victoria," I said, moving to the presentation area with the confidence that 18 months of board meetings had given me. I'm proud to report that our integrated approach to sustainable construction has not only met our environmental goals, but has actually enhanced the financial performance of every project we've completed. I clicked to the next slide, displaying cost comparisons that demonstrated how sustainable building practices, when properly implemented, reduced long-term operational expenses while increasing property values. These weren't theoretical projections, but actual data from Sterling Properties developments, proof that environmental responsibility and business success weren't competing priorities. For Phase 2, we're implementing several innovative approaches that will set new standards for the industry. Our partnership with Chen & Walsh Construction has been particularly valuable in developing these methodologies. Another click brought up photos from recent Chen & Walsh projects, showcasing the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. Solar installations that doubled as architectural features, rainwater collection systems that enhanced rather than detracted from building aesthetics, and energy-efficient lighting systems that created better environments for building occupants. Robert Chen and his team have demonstrated exceptional adaptability in mastering sustainable construction techniques, I continued, making eye contact with my father for the first time during the presentation. Their commitment to learning new approaches while maintaining their reputation for quality and reliability has made them invaluable partners in achieving our ambitious sustainability goals. My father's expression had shifted from surprise to something that looked like wonder. He was hearing his company praised by his daughter, but more than that, he was hearing his daughter speak with authority about an industry he'd spent decades mastering. The woman standing at the front of this boardroom wasn't the idealistic recent graduate he'd dismissed as too soft for the real world. She was a professional whose expertise commanded respect from some of the most successful developers in the Pacific Northwest. Victoria returned to the podium to discuss financial projections and timeline details, but I remained standing near the presentation screen, available for technical questions about the sustainability components. Several stakeholders approached me during the break, asking about specific environmental technologies and implementation strategies. Each conversation reinforced my role as the expert in the room, the person others turned to for guidance on the increasingly important intersection of construction and environmental responsibility. "Alexandra," said Margaret Thompson, CEO of Pacific Northwest Hospitality Group, "I'd love to discuss how Sterling Properties' sustainability approach might be adapted for our upcoming resort development in Central Oregon. Would you be available for a consulting engagement?" "I appreciate the interest," I replied, "but Sterling Properties keeps me quite busy with our current project pipeline. However, I might be able to recommend some excellent firms that specialize in sustainable hospitality development." The exchange was professional and routine, but I noticed my father listening from a few feet away, hearing his daughter turn down consulting opportunities because her primary role was too demanding to accommodate additional work. In his world, turning down paying clients was something only very successful professionals could afford to do. The formal presentation concluded with Victoria's announcement of Phase 2 construction timelines and budget allocations. Chen & Walsh Construction, would oversee the primary building components while coordinating with specialized subcontractors for advanced environmental systems. It was a significant contract, the kind that could establish my father's company as a leader in sustainable construction rather than a traditional firm learning new techniques. As the meeting dispersed, I found myself standing near the windows with James Rodriguez, who had attended as a Sterling Properties Advisory Board member. He'd been watching the presentations with the satisfied expression of someone who'd seen his mentoring investment pay dividends. 6 months ago, did you imagine this conversation happening? He asked, gesturing toward the room where my father was discussing project details with Victoria Sterling. Honestly, no, I admitted. I thought helping Chen and Walsh develop sustainability capabilities might be a way to bridge some family tensions. I didn't expect it to become such a comprehensive partnership. The best business relationships often develop that way, James said. When both parties bring genuine value to the collaboration, the results tend to exceed everyone's expectations. Genuine value. That phrase captured something important about how my relationship with Chen and Walsh had evolved. I hadn't been helping my father's company out of family obligation or trying to prove something about my own capabilities. I'd been sharing expertise that genuinely benefited their business while learning from their experience with project management and client relations. Marcus appeared at my elbow, his face bright with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen from him since college. Alex, this is incredible. When Victoria introduced you as Director of Sustainable Development, I literally did a double take. I mean, I knew you were working with Sterling Properties, but I had no idea you were basically running their environmental strategy. It's been a gradual progression, I said, which was true even if it didn't capture the full scope of how dramatically my role had expanded since joining Sterling Properties Board 18 months earlier. The company's commitment to sustainability has created opportunities for people with the right expertise. And you definitely have the right expertise, Marcus said, shaking his head in amazement. Dad's been talking nonstop about the things you've taught our project managers. He says working with you has been like getting a master class in modern construction techniques. A master class. From the man who had once dismissed my knowledge as too theoretical for practical application. The transformation in my father's perception of my capabilities had been gradual but unmistakable, emerging through months of collaborative problem-solving that demonstrated the value of my expertise in concrete, measurable ways. Victoria Sterling joined our conversation, carrying the relaxed satisfaction that came from a successful presentation. Alexandra, I hope you're proud of what we've accomplished together. When I first met you 18 months ago, I knew you had exceptional technical knowledge. But watching you develop into a strategic leader has been even more impressive. Strategic leader. The phrase felt weighty, significant in ways that went beyond professional recognition. For years, I'd been focused on proving my competence, demonstrating that I understood sustainable construction as well as anyone in the industry. But competence and leadership were different qualities, and hearing Victoria acknowledge both felt like recognition of growth I hadn't fully appreciated in myself. I've had excellent mentors, I said, glancing between Victoria and James. And working with companies like Chen and Walsh has taught me that the best sustainable construction happens when environmental expertise combines with solid project management fundamentals. Speaking of Chen and Walsh, Victoria said, I'm curious about your long-term vision for that partnership. Robert's company has made remarkable progress, but I sense there's potential for even deeper collaboration. It was a perceptive observation. Over the past 6 months, my consulting relationship with Chen and Walsh had evolved beyond technical training to include strategic planning, client development, and business expansion discussions. We'd talked about opening a dedicated sustainable construction division, pursuing lead consulting opportunities, and positioning the company as a regional leader in environmental building practices. We're exploring several possibilities, I said carefully. aware that my father was close enough to overhear our conversation. The success of these Sterling Properties projects has opened doors for Chen and Walsh that didn't exist before. Opened doors. That was an understatement. Since completing their first LEED-certified project under my guidance, Chen and Walsh had received inquiries from 3 other major developers, all interested in working with a local firm that understood both traditional construction and sustainable building requirements. My father's company was experiencing the kind of growth that came from being positioned at the intersection of industry trends, rather than struggling to catch up with them. The gathering gradually dispersed as participants returned to their respective offices and obligations. I lingered in the boardroom, looking out at the Portland skyline and thinking about how much had changed since that first coffee conversation with Marcus. What had started as my brother asking for advice had become a comprehensive business partnership that was transforming both my family's company and my own professional trajectory. My father approached as I was gathering my presentation materials, his expression thoughtful in the way that suggested he was processing information that would take time to fully absorb. "Alexandra," he said, his voice carrying a formality that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "I owe you an apology." The statement hung between us, unexpected and weighty. My father wasn't someone who apologized easily or frequently. In the Chen family tradition, mistakes were acknowledged through changed behavior rather than explicit admissions of fault. "For what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what he was going to say. "For not seeing what you were building," he said, gesturing toward the boardroom where he'd just watched his daughter present to industry leaders as an equal. "For thinking that because your approach was different from mine, it was somehow less valid or less serious." The apology was more generous than I'd expected, and more painful, because it confirmed what I'd always suspected but never wanted to believe, that my father's dismissal of my capabilities hadn't been based on objective assessment of my skills, but on his inability to recognize expertise that didn't match his own experience. "You built your business using the methods that worked for your generation," I said carefully. "There's nothing wrong with proven approaches. But there's something wrong with assuming that proven approaches are the only valid ones," he replied. "I spent so much time worrying that you were too idealistic for the real world that I missed the fact that you were actually ahead of the real world." Ahead of the real world. It was a remarkable admission from a man who had prided himself on understanding how business actually worked, who had built his identity around being practical and realistic while his daughter chased impractical dreams. "The industry has been changing faster than most of us realized," I said diplomatically. "Sustainable construction went from niche specialty to standard requirement pretty quickly." "And you saw it coming," he said. "While I was dismissing environmental concerns as marketing trends, you were building expertise in what turned out to be the future of construction." We stood together looking out at the Portland skyline, father and daughter who had spent years talking past each other, finally finding common ground in shared professional respect. The view from Sterling Properties' boardroom encompassed several buildings that Chen and Walsh had constructed over the past decade, solid structures that would serve their purposes for generations, but represented approaches that were already becoming obsolete. "What are your plans now?" my father asked. "Victoria mentioned that Sterling Properties is expanding their sustainable development division." "We're exploring several growth opportunities," I said, which was true but incomplete. Victoria and I had been discussing the possibility of opening Sterling Properties' first regional sustainability consulting branch, with me as the managing director. It would mean overseeing projects across the Pacific Northwest, developing partnerships with innovative construction firms, and establishing new standards for environmentally responsible luxury development. "And Chen and Walsh?" he asked. "Are we still going to be part of your plans?" The question revealed an insecurity I hadn't expected from my father. Robert Chen, who had always been confident about his company's value and relevance, was now asking his daughter whether she still wanted to work with the family business that had once dismissed her expertise. Chen & Walsh has become one of the most capable sustainable construction firms in the region, I said honestly. Any expansion of Sterling Properties activities would naturally include continued partnership with companies that share our commitment to environmental responsibility and construction excellence. My father smiled, and I realized it was the first completely genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Not the polite expression he wore at family dinners, or the professional mask he used in business meetings, but the real satisfaction that came from hearing his company praised by someone whose opinion he'd learned to value. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing potential in Chen & Walsh that we couldn't see in ourselves, and for helping us realize that potential instead of just pointing out our limitations." The gratitude was sincere and specific, focused not just on professional guidance but on the way I'd approached our collaboration. I could have used my expertise to highlight everything Chen & Walsh was doing wrong, could have emphasized their inexperience with sustainable construction to make myself seem more valuable by comparison. Instead, I'd focused on building their capabilities, sharing knowledge in ways that strengthened their company, rather than creating dependence on my consulting services. Good partnerships benefit everyone involved, I said, echoing something Victoria Sterling had told me during my first months at Sterling Properties. The goal was never to make Chen & Walsh dependent on outside expertise, but to help you develop internal capabilities that would serve your clients better. As we prepared to leave the boardroom, my father paused near the door, looking back at the presentation screen that still displayed images from our successful projects. "You know," he said, "Marcus told me about a conversation you had months ago, where you explained what it would take for Chen & Walsh to become competitive in sustainable construction. You said it would require someone in leadership to get LEED certification, develop new supplier relationships, invest in training and equipment." I remembered that conversation, the morning at Stumptown when Marcus had asked whether his company could realistically transition to sustainable building practices. I'd outlined the steps required, the timeline for developing legitimate expertise, the challenges of changing operational approaches that had worked well for decades. "I remember," I said. "What you didn't mention," my father continued, "was that Chen & Walsh already had access to someone with all of those qualifications. We didn't need to develop sustainable construction expertise from scratch. We just needed to recognize the expertise that was already in our family." The observation was perceptive and generous, crediting me with capabilities that my family had been slow to acknowledge. But it also revealed my father's growing understanding of how business relationships actually worked, how the most valuable partnerships often involved recognizing and utilizing strengths that already existed rather than trying to create new capabilities from nothing. We rode the elevator down together in comfortable silence, each of us processing the morning's revelations in our own way. The lobby of the U.S. Bancorp Tower bustled with the usual lunch-hour energy, lawyers and consultants and executives moving between meetings that would shape Portland's continuing development. Outside, the autumn air carried the crisp promise of seasonal change, and the city looked different to me than it had that morning. Not because Portland itself had changed, but because my place in its professional landscape had been publicly acknowledged in ways that would influence every future interaction with clients, colleagues, and competitors. My father and I parted, with a handshake that felt more like a partnership agreement than a family goodbye. We would see each other at the job site next week, would continue working together on projects that combined his company's operational expertise with my environmental knowledge, would keep building something that neither of us could have created, alone. Walking back to my car, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months ago, I'd been Alexandra the consultant, struggling to establish credibility in an industry that valued traditional approaches over innovative thinking. Today, I was Alexandra the director, leading sustainability initiatives for one of the region's most influential development companies, while helping transform my family's business into a model for sustainable construction practices. The recognition felt satisfying, but not in the way I'd expected. For years, I'd imagined that professional success would feel like vindication, like proof that everyone who had doubted my capabilities had been wrong. Instead, it felt like completion, like the natural result of focusing on building something valuable rather than trying to prove something to people who hadn't been ready to see it. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Sterling. Excellent. Presentation today. The board is excited about Phase 2, and several members asked about scheduling consulting sessions with you for their own projects. Are you ready to become the go-to expert on sustainable luxury development in the Pacific Northwest? I smiled at the question, thinking about how different it was from the conversations I'd been having with my family just months earlier. Instead of asking whether I was ready for the real world, industry leaders were asking whether I was ready to shape that world's future direction. I typed back quickly, ready to keep building something meaningful, looking forward to the next challenge. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Chen and Walsh Construction had built dozens of structures over the past 2 decades, past Sterling Properties developments that were setting new standards for environmental responsibility, through a city that was transforming itself block by block through the work of people who understood that construction wasn't just about putting buildings in place, but about creating spaces where communities could thrive. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw someone I was still learning to recognize. Not the daughter who had spent years trying to earn her family's respect, not the consultant who had struggled to prove her expertise to skeptical clients, but the professional who had found her place in an industry that valued her contributions and respected her vision. The light turned green, and I drove toward home through the Portland afternoon, thinking about the projects we would build, the standards we would establish, the future we were creating one sustainable structure at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate that environmental responsibility and business success weren't competing priorities, but complementary aspects of construction done right. Tonight, though, I would celebrate the recognition that had been years in the making, the moment when everyone finally understood what I'd been building all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.